The official Terra Alliance integration manual hit the bottom of Jaxen Vane's incinerator chute with a satisfying metallic thud, exactly 3 seconds after the pneumatic mail tube had spatted into his face. It was a thick, glossy pamphlet featuring a digitally altered image of a human and a Vorgari shaking hands beneath the banner. Unity through shared space. Jaxen spat a glob of bitter coffee back into his mug and stared at the chute. Unity through shared bullshit, he rasped, his voice sounding like two tectonic plates grinding together. It was 7 in the morning in Iron Spires, and the artificial sun lamps were struggling to pierce the thick, industrial smog that clung to Sector 4. Jaxen's apartment was a cramped collection of rusted gears, scavenged capacitors, and the persistent smell of ozone. He preferred it that way. Machines didn't try to integrate with you. They didn't have treaties. They just worked or they broke, and Jaxen was very good at fixing things that broke. The buzz of his wristcom interrupted his silent contemplation of the smog. A holographic projection of Director Valerius appeared, looking as stiff and lifeless as a funeral director. "Citizen Vane," the projection intoned, "our records indicate you have ignored 6 mandatory notifications regarding the Harmonization Initiative. As a recipient of the Silver Star for Valor during the Siege of Xylos, your participation is not optional. You represent the face of human Vorgari reconciliation." "I lost half my squad at Xylos, Valerius," Jaxen growled, not even looking at the hologram. "The only reconciliation I want with a Vorgari is through the sights of a pulse rifle." "The war ended 4 years ago, Jaxen. The Treaty of Obsidian Sands is absolute. Your assigned harmonization specialist is scheduled for arrival at 0800 hours. Failure to grant entry will result in immediate revocation of your scavenging license and a mandatory term in a re-education facility. Choose wisely." The hologram flickered and died. Jaxen cursed, slamming his fist against a stack of discarded circuit boards. He looked at the clock. 7:45. He had 15 minutes to prepare for an alien invader to move into his living room. He spent 10 of those minutes searching for a clean shirt, eventually settling on a faded olive-drab tunic that still had a faint stain from hydraulic fluid. He didn't bother cleaning the sink or the piles of scrap metal. If the Vorgari wanted to live with a human, they could live with a messy one. At precisely 8 o'clock, the heavy reinforced door of his apartment let out a low, melodic chime. Jaxen gripped the edge of his kitchen counter, his knuckles white. He considered for a fleeting second, grabbing the illegal kinetic pistol hidden under the floorboards. Instead, he took a deep breath and slapped the door release. The door slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. Standing in the dimly lit corridor was a figure that seemed to belong to another dimension entirely. She was tall, nearly 6 feet, with skin the color of a late summer twilight. A deep, shimmering lavender that seemed to catch the meager light of the hallway. Her eyes were wide and almond-shaped, featuring glowing amber irises that lacked pupils. Her hair was a cascade of white-silver filaments that moved slightly, as if caught in an invisible current. She wore the standard-issue white robe of the Harmonization Bureau, which did little to hide the lithe, athletic grace of her silhouette. "Greetings, Citizen Jaxen Vane," she said. Her voice wasn't a sound so much as a vibration, a rich melodic resonance that felt like a warm hum in the center of his chest. "I am Lyra Nexus, Specialist Grade 3. I am here to facilitate our mutual integration." Jaxen stared at her for a long beat. Up close, the Vorgari didn't look like the monsters he'd fought in the trenches. They looked like something beautiful that had been shattered and glued back together with starlight. It made him even angrier. "The manual is in the incinerator," Jaxen said, leaning against the doorframe. "The couch is broken, the heater works every other Tuesday, and I don't do small talk. You want to integrate? Stay out of my way." Lyra stepped inside, her movements fluid and silent. She carried a small hexagonal case that hovered a few inches above her palm. Her amber eyes swept over the chaotic apartment, pausing on a pile of rusted actuator joints. "Your dwelling possesses a high degree of entropic character," she remarked, her voice remaining perfectly calm. "It is authentic." "It's a dump," Jaxen corrected, closing the door. "And it's private, or at least it was." Lyra set her case down on the only clear spot on the floor. "I understand your hostility, Jaxen. My people took much from you, but the High Command and your alliance believe that by living together, We might cease to see each other as shadows on a battlefield. Is that what they told you in specialist school? Jaxen sneered. Listen, Lyra. You're here because Valerius wants to keep an eye on Kubin like me. I'm here because I don't want to go to prison. Let's not pretend this is anything else. Lyra tilted her head, a gesture that caused her silver hair to shimmer. Is that what you believe? That I am a spy? In my experience, anyone who smiles while they're taking your home is a spy or a politician, usually both. Lyra didn't argue. She simply opened her case. A soft blue light emanated from within, and a series of small crystalline spheres floated out, arranging themselves in a circle around her. What are those? Jaxen asked, his hand instinctively reaching for a heavy wrench on the table. Atmospheric stabilizers, she replied. Vorgari physiology requires a specific ionic balance to maintain cellular integrity. I will not intrude upon your oxygen supply, I assure you. As the spheres began to hum, a faint, sweet scent, like jasmine mixed with ozone, filled the room. Jaxen felt a strange tightness in his chest ease, just for a second, before he caught himself and scowled. Whatever, he muttered. I'm going to work. Don't touch my scrap. Don't reorganize my kitchen. And for the love of the stars, don't try to harmonize anything. He grabbed his toolkit and headed for the door, but he stopped when he felt a soft pressure against his mind. Not a thought, but a feeling of profound loneliness. He turned back, but Lyra was already busy adjusting her stabilizers, her back to him. You're late, Jaxen, she said softly without looking up. How do you know that? Your heart rate. It has been accelerated since I arrived. You are anxious to leave. Jaxen didn't answer. He stepped out into the smog-choked air of iron spires, his mind racing. She was just an alien, a twilight-skinned, silver-haired alien who could sense his heart rate. He had survived the war, but as he descended the rusted stairs of the Sector 4 towers, Jaxen Vane had a sinking feeling that the peace was going to be much harder to navigate than the combat. The salvage yard was the only place Jaxen felt at peace. It was a massive graveyard of fallen skyships and forgotten machinery located on the fringe of iron spires. Here, the only thing that mattered was the weight of steel and the value of a salvaged core. You look like you've seen a ghost, or worse, a tax collector, a voice shouted from beneath the rusted hull of a scout vessel. Kalen crawled out, his face smeared with grease and his goggles hanging lopsided. Kalen was the only person Jaxen trusted, a brilliant engineer who had been dishonorably discharged for hacking into the Alliance's internal payroll to pay for his sister's medical bills. She arrived, Jaxen said, dropping his tool bag. Kalen whistled, wiping his hands on a rag. The Vorgari? What's the verdict? Is she as scary as the propaganda says? She's purple, Jaxen said flatly, and she smells like flowers and electricity. She's currently setting up some kind of crystal show in my living room. Kalen's expression turned serious. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. Listen, Jax, I've been hearing things on the dark nets. This harmonization initiative isn't just about PR. There are reports from Sector 2. People living with Vorgari are changing. Jaxen frowned. Changing how? They become docile, happy, too happy. There's a rumor that the Vorgari are in their resonance phase, a biological cycle that happens once every few years. The Alliance calls it a mating season to make it sound romantic, but some hackers think it's a wide-scale synaptic broadcast. Jaxen thought of the sweet scent in his apartment and the strange easing of his chest. A broadcast? You mean mind control? Not control exactly. More like synchronization. They broadcast their emotional state. If they feel peaceful, you feel peaceful. If they feel loyal, you feel loyal. It's like a biological virus for the soul. I've got a mental firewall, Kyle, Jaxen said, though his hand shook slightly as he reached for a soldering iron. No purple-skinned girl is going to make me forget what they did at Silos. Just be careful, man, and watch her eyes. If the amber starts to pulse, get out of there. That means the transmission is peaking. Jaxen spent the rest of the day in a blur of activity, trying to drown out Kalen's warnings with the scream of a plasma cutter. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lyra's amber gaze and the way she moved like water. When he returned to his apartment that evening, He expected to find it in ruins, or at least rearranged beyond recognition. Instead, the place was eerily quiet. The piles of scrap were still there, but they had been dusted. The air was cool and crisp, the heavy smog of the city completely filtered out by Lyra's stabilizers. Lyra was sitting cross-legged in the center of the living room, surrounded by her floating spheres. She was no longer wearing her robe, but a form-fitting bodysuit of dark, iridescent mesh that looked like it was woven from spider silk. "You are late," she said, her voice echoing with that strange resonance. "Ran into some stubborn bolts," Jaxen lied, tossing his jacket onto a chair. He noticed a small bowl on the table containing a vibrant blue liquid that shimmered with an inner light. "What's that? Poison?" "It is a nutrient broth," Lyra replied, opening her eyes. "Rich in amino acids and electrolytes. I prepared enough for two. Your biology is currently deficient in magnesium and zinc." "I like my deficiencies just fine, thanks," Jaxen said, heading for the kitchen to find a beer. He found his fridge reorganized. The beer was at the back, replaced at the front by several flasks of the blue broth. "Hey, I told you not to touch my stuff." "I did not touch your scrap," she said calmly, rising to her feet. "But your food storage was a biological hazard. I merely harmonized it." "Stop using that word," Jaxen snapped, turning to face her. "Harmonized, integrated, synchronized. It's all just fancy talk for taking over. You're in my house, Lyra. My rules. And rule number 1 is, leave my beer alone." Lyra stepped toward him. As she moved, the sweet scent from earlier intensified, becoming almost intoxicating. Jaxen felt his anger flickering, like a flame being starved of oxygen. He fought against it, gripping the edge of the fridge. "You are experiencing a high level of cortisol," Lyra observed. She was standing barely a foot away now. Her amber eyes were bright, and to Jackson's horror, he saw a faint rhythmic pulse deep within the irises. "It is harmful to your cellular longevity. If you would simply allow the resonance to—" "I'm not allowing anything," Jaxen roared, though it felt more like a plea. "Stay out of my head, Lyra. I know what you're doing. Kel told me about the resonance phase. You're trying to sync me." Lyra froze. The pulsing in her eyes stopped, and a look of genuine sadness crossed her face. "Is that what you think?" she whispered. "That this is a weapon? Isn't it? You win the war not with ships, but by making us love our occupiers. It's genius, really." Lyra looked down at her hands. Her skin seemed to glow with a soft, bioluminescent hum. "The resonance is not a choice, Jaxen. It is as natural to us as breathing is to you. My body is preparing for a cycle of connection. I cannot stop it any more than you can stop the sun from rising." "Then do it somewhere else." "I cannot. The treaty requires me to be here. And I chose you." Jaxen blinked. "What?" "The matching algorithm provided 5 candidates. 3 were politicians. 1 was a corporate executive. And then there was you, a man who fixes broken things. A man who refuses to forget the past even when it hurts him." She looked up at him, and for the first time, Jaxen didn't see an alien. He saw a person who was just as trapped as he was. "I did not come here to conquer your mind, Jaxen Vane," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I came here because I am tired of the silence of my own people. I wanted to see if a human heart was truly as loud and stubborn as the stories say." The room was silent for a long moment. The only sound was the low hum of the stabilizers and the distant roar of the city outside. Jaxen felt the wall of his prejudice cracking just a tiny bit. "It's louder," he muttered, finally reaching past her and grabbing a beer. "And a lot more annoying." He walked over to the broken couch and sat down, taking a long swig of the bitter brew. Lyra remained standing by the kitchen, her silver hair shimmering in the dim light. "So," Jaxen said, trying to ignore the way his chest felt strangely light. "This resonance phase, how long does it last?" "The first stage is 3 days," Lyra replied, her voice regaining its composure. "The second stage, the bonding stage, begins on the 4th. And what happens if you don't bond with someone?" Lyra's amber eyes flickered toward the window. "The energy has nowhere to go. It reflects inward. It leads to neural degradation. In my culture, it is considered a great tragedy, a soul that remains unheard." Jaxen looked at the blue broth on the table, then back at the twilight-skinned woman who had been sent to live in his scrap-filled life. Well, he said, staring into his beer, you'd better drink your blue soup then. We've got a long 3 days ahead of us. As Jackson went to bed that night, he made sure to lock his door. But as he lay in the darkness, he couldn't help but notice that for the first time in 4 years, the nightmares of Xylos didn't come. Instead, he dreamed of lavender skies and a song that sounded like home. He woke up at 3 in the morning, his skin covered in a light sheen of sweat. The apartment was silent, but a soft, rhythmic, pulsing light was glowing from beneath his bedroom door. It was pink, vibrant, and felt almost like a heartbeat. Jackson sat up, his heart racing. He remembered Kalen's warning. If the light starts to pulse, get out. But as he looked at the door, he didn't feel fear. He felt a strange, magnetic pull. The mating season hadn't just begun. It was calling to him. And Jaxen Vane, the man who was too stubborn to forget the war, found himself wondering if he was strong enough to survive the peace. The dawn did not break over iron spires. It simply leaked through the smog in stagnant shades of charcoal and bruised plum. Jaxen Vane awoke with his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a cold sweat slicking his skin. The dream had been different this time. Usually it was the sound of screaming metal and the smell of scorched ozone from the Xylos trenches. But last night, the trenches had been filled with lavender light, and the screams had been replaced by a haunting melodic hum that vibrated in his very marrow. He sat up, his head throbbing with a dull ache that felt like a hangover without the benefit of the whiskey. The air in his bedroom felt charged, thick with the scent of jasmine and heavy static. He looked at his wristcom. It was 6:30 in the morning. As he swung his legs out of bed, he noticed a faint, rhythmic pulsing of pink light bleeding through the gap beneath his door. It was stronger than it had been at midnight, deeper, more organic. It didn't flicker like a failing neon tube. It expanded and contracted like a lung. Jackson grabbed a heavy wrench from his bedside table, a habit from years of living in Sector 4, and approached the door. He slapped the release sensor. The door slid back, and he was nearly blinded by the sheer intensity of the atmosphere. The living room had been transformed into a luminous grotto. Lyra was huddled in the center of the floor, her crystalline stabilizers spinning at a frantic velocity. The blue light they usually emitted had been drowned out by a visceral, pulsing magenta radiance that seemed to be emanating from Lyra herself. Her skin, usually a calm twilight lavender, was now translucent in places, revealing glowing networks of bioluminescent veins that looked like mapped constellations. Her silver hair was no longer flowing. It was standing on end, twitching like 1,000 sensitive antennae. She didn't look up when he entered. Her amber eyes were shut tight, her jaw clenched in an expression of raw, unadulterated agony. "Lyra!" Jackson called out, his voice cracking. He dropped the wrench. It hit the floor with a heavy clang that seemed to echo with unnatural volume in the charged air. Lyra's eyes snapped open. The amber irises were gone, replaced by solid, glowing pools of white fire. A shock wave of pure emotion hit Jackson then, a tidal wave of longing, grief, and a terrifying sense of isolation. It wasn't his emotion, but he felt it as clearly as if someone had poured liquid lead into his veins. He stumbled back, his knees hitting the edge of the broken sofa. "Jackson!" she gasped, her voice no longer melodic. It was a distorted rasp, layered with harmonic frequencies that made the glass jars in his kitchen rattle. The frequency. It is too high. I cannot contain the resonance." Jackson forced himself to stand, fighting against the psychic pressure that was trying to drive him to his knees. "What do I do? Tell me how to fix this, Lyra. Is there a pill? A shutdown code?" "No code," she groaned, her body arching as a fresh surge of light pulsed through her. "The biological imperative, it requires a focal point. My people, we synchronize as a collective. But here, I am a lone signal in a void of static." She reached out a trembling hand. Her fingers were trailing wisps of glowing vapor, biogenic dust, the very thing Kalen had warned him about. Jackson stared at her hand, his mind screaming for him to bolt for the door, to call the Harmonization Bureau, to save himself. But then he looked at her face. Behind the glowing white fire of her eyes, he saw the person who had cleaned his scrap piles. He saw the being who had tried to fix his deficiencies with blue soup. He saw a soul that was terrified of drowning in its own light. He took a step forward, then another. The closer he got, the more the jasmine scent felt like a physical weight in his lungs. The air hummed with 20,000 volts of pure intention. "Listen to me, Sparky," Jaxen said, using a derogatory slang term for Vorgari that felt strangely softened in his mouth. "I don't know how to synchronize. I'm a grease monkey. I fix rusted actuators and burn out cores. But if you need a focal point, I'm right here. I'm not going anywhere." He reached out and grabbed her hand. The impact was like being struck by lightning. His vision whited out, and suddenly he wasn't in his cramped apartment anymore. He was standing on a cliffside of obsidian glass overlooking a sea of liquid starlight. He felt the collective history of the Vorgari, the centuries of shared thought, the beauty of a world where no one was ever truly alone, and the crushing weight of the empire that had turned that connection into a chain of command. He felt Lyra's childhood, the way she had been selected for her high empathic resonance, and the quiet rebellion she felt when she realized her gifts were being used as diplomatic grease. And she felt him. She felt the mud of Xylos, the cold iron of the spires, and the deep, aching void where his squad mates used to be. She felt his stubbornness, his cynicism, and the tiny flickering ember of hope he had buried under 100 layers of scar tissue. Slowly, the white light faded. Jaxen found himself back on his living room floor, gasping for air, his hands still clamped tightly around Lyra's. The magenta glow had receded, settling into a soft, manageable hum. Lyra's eyes had returned to their amber hue, though they were now wet with what looked like liquid silver. You took it," she whispered, her voice returning to its melodic resonance. "The excess frequency. You grounded me, Jaxen Vane." Jaxen pulled his hand away, his fingers tingling with residual static. He looked at his palm. A faint, glowing tracery of lines remained, fading slowly back into his skin. "Don't get used to it. I've got enough ghosts in my head without adding yours to the mix." He stood up, his legs feeling like they were made of gelatin. He checked the clock. It had only been 3 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. "We need to get you out of here," Jaxen said, his voice regaining its gritty edge. "That pulse probably lit up every sensor in the sector. If the Ironheads, the security patrols, see you like this, they'll have you in an isolation ward before you can say harmonization." Lyra nodded weakly, leaning on him as she stood. "The resonance phase is entering its second day. The biogenic output will only increase. I must find a way to damp the signal." "I know a guy," Jaxen said, already reaching for his jacket. "But we're going to have to move fast. Put that robe back on. Hood up. If anyone asks, you're a human with a rare skin condition and a very bad attitude." They slipped out of the apartment into the gray gloom of Sector 4. The verticality of iron spires was both a blessing and a curse. There were 1,000 places to hide, but only one way down. As they navigated the rusted gantries, Jaxen noticed the way people looked at them. The tension in the city was palpable. On every street corner, digital billboards screamed about the Harmonization Festival, but beneath the glossy images, the reality was much uglier. He saw a group of 5 human teenagers throwing stones at a Vorgari specialist who was trying to clean a public fountain. The Vorgari didn't fight back. He simply bowed his head, his twilight skin bruising to a dark, ugly indigo. Further down, an Alliance patrol was dragging a woman out of her HAB unit, while her Vorgari partner screamed in a language that sounded like breaking crystal. "Why do they do it?" Lyra asked, her voice a ghost of a sound. "The treaty promised peace." "Peace is just a period of time where people sharpen their knives," Jaxen said, pulling her into the shadow of a massive ventilation duct as a drone buzzed overhead. "The Alliance doesn't want peace, Lyra. They want control. And your people? They're just a different kind of knife." "I am not a knife," she said firmly. "Maybe not, but you're leaking enough light to make me think otherwise. Now shut up and move. We're almost at the salvage yard." The walk took them through the bowels of the city, a place where the sun lamps never reached and the air was thick with the smell of recycled water and desperation. This was Jaxen's world, the place where the discarded things of the Empire came to die. As they crossed the final gantry toward the scrapyard, Jaxen felt a sudden, sharp prickling at the back of his neck. He stopped, pulling Lyra behind a stack of rusted shipping containers. "What is it?" she whispered. "Tail," Jaxen grunted. He checked his wristcom. The V-pulse refractor he'd been forced to wear was blinking a steady rhythmic green. "The government-issued jewelry is singing. They've been tracking us since we left the hab." From the shadows of the gantry, three figures emerged. They weren't soldiers, but they weren't civilians either. They wore the gray, nondescript jumpsuits of the Bureau of Internal Harmony. Each one carried a long, black rod that Jaxen knew was a neural inhibitor. "Citizen Vane," the lead officer said, his voice cold and robotic, "Specialist Nexus has been flagged for biological instability. Under Directive 101, you are required to surrender her for immediate containment." Jaxen looked at the officers, then at Lyra. Her hand was shaking, the magenta light beginning to pulse again at the edges of her fingernails. "Containment, huh?" Jaxen said, his hand sliding toward the concealed holster at his small of his back. "That's a funny way of saying dissection. Sorry, boys, I just got the place cleaned. I'm not ready for her to move out yet." "This is not a negotiation, Vane," the officer said, stepping forward. "We lost 500 good men to the Vorgari at Xylos. Don't tell me you've forgotten whose side you're on." "I haven't forgotten a damn thing," Jaxen spat. "Especially not the fact that the Alliance left us in those trenches to die while they negotiated their precious treaty. If you want her, you're going to have to go through me. And I've got 20 years of bad habits that say you won't make it." The officer raised his inhibitor rod. Jaxen drew his kinetic pistol. The world narrowed down to the sound of his own breathing and the soft, jasmine-scented hum of the woman standing behind him. In that moment, Jaxen Vane realized he wasn't fighting for a Vorgari. He was fighting for the right to choose his own enemies. And for the first time in his life, the people in the gray jumpsuits were at the top of the list. The air in the gantry erupted in a chaos of blue sparks and the sharp crack of kinetic rounds. Jaxen fired a warning shot, the slug shearing through a rusted support beam and sending a shower of orange sparks over the Bureau officers. It was a distraction, nothing more. He grabbed Lyra's arm and hauled her toward the entrance of the salvage yard. "Bug out! Now!" he yelled, the street slang for a tactical retreat tearing from his throat. They scrambled over a pile of discarded engine cowlings, the Bureau agents hot on their heels. The inhibitors hissed, arcs of agonizing neural energy narrowly missing Jaxen's heels. One hit a stack of capacitors, causing them to explode in a spectacular display of electrical blue fire. "Over here!" a voice hissed from a dark crevice beneath a downed freighter. Kalen appeared, waving them into a narrow tunnel shielded by lead-lined plating. Jaxen and Lyra dove inside, and Kalen immediately slapped a magnetic seal onto the hatch. The sound of boots on metal echoed outside, followed by muffled curses and then silence. "You're insane, Jax," Kalen panted, his goggles fogged with sweat. "Telling the Bureau to go kick rocks? Do you know what they do to people who interfere with a specialist retrieval? You'll be lucky if they just flatline you." "They were going to take her to a lab, Kale," Jaxen said, leaning against the cold metal wall, his heart finally beginning to slow. "Directive 101 is a death sentence." "It's worse than that," Kalen said, his eyes darting to Lyra, who was huddled in the corner, her light dimmed to a faint, sickly violet. "I finished the decryption on that drive you brought me yesterday, the one from the Bureau's trash." He led them deeper into the tunnel, into a cramped workshop filled with flickering monitors and the hum of high-end processors. Kalen tapped a few keys, and a complex holographic schematic appeared in the air. It showed a human brain, but it was overlaid with a shimmering, crystalline lattice. "This is the Synaptic Sovereign Project," Kalen whispered, his voice trembling. "The Alliance isn't just trying to harmonize with the Vorgari. They're using the Vorgari mating season as a carrier signal. The biogenic dust they release, it's not just pheromones, it's a programmable, nano-organic mesh." Jaxen walked up to the hologram, his hand passing through the glowing lattice. "Explain it to me like I'm a grunt, Kyle." "The Vorgari are natural transmitters, right? Their resonance phase is a massive broadcast of emotional and neural data. The Alliance realized that if they could put a specialist in every influential household, they could create a planetary network. The biogenic dust enters the human host's lungs, travels to the brain, and builds that lattice you see there." Kalen pointed to a small pulsing icon at the base of the brain. "That's the V-pulse refractor, the thing they made you wear. It's not a monitor, it's a receiver. It takes the raw emotional power of the Vorgari resonance and converts it into a command signal. It doesn't make you happy, Jax. It makes you compliant. Jaxen felt a cold, oily dread settle in his stomach. He looked at the device on his wrist. So the whole treaty, the whole unity through shared space thing, it's a firmware update for humanity, Kalen finished. By the time the Harmonization Festival ends in 2 days, every human in Iron Spires will be part of a hive mind. We won't be slaves in chains. We'll be slaves who think they're in love. Lyra stood up, her eyes wide with horror. My people, we did not know. We were told this was a way to share our culture, to heal the wounds of the war. Your high command knew, Kalen said not unkindly. They get a planet full of docile workers, and our politicians get a population that never complains, never strikes, and never revolts. It's a win-win for everyone except the people actually living here. Jaxen gripped the edge of Kalen's workbench so hard the metal groaned. The betrayal was so deep it felt structural. The men he had fought beside, the friends he had lost, they had been sacrificed for a war that ended in a lobotomy for the survivors. Can we stop it? Jaxen asked. The signal originates from the central transmission spire in Sector 1, Kalen said, but it's protected by a military-grade firewall and 3 battalions of Alliance elite. Even if we got inside, we'd need a key to override the Vorgari frequencies. He looked at Lyra. She's the key, Jaxen realized. Exactly, Kalen said. During the peak of the resonance, the 3rd day, a specialist's output is high enough to override the system from the inside. If she can get to the core, she can broadcast a reset pulse instead of a compliance pulse. It would shatter the nanomesh in everyone's heads before it can permanently bond. But Kalen, Lyra said, her voice small, to broadcast at that magnitude, it would require the full completion of my cycle. I told Jaxen, I am a lone signal. Without a focal point to ground the feedback, the energy would burn out my neural pathways. You'd die, Jaxen said flatly. I would, she confirmed. I would become a hollow shell, a soul that has spent all its light. The silence in the workshop was heavy, broken only by the whirring of cooling fans. Jaxen looked at Lyra. She was a Vorgari. She was the enemy. But she was also the only being in the city who had looked at him and seen something worth saving. She had chosen him. There's another way, Jaxen said, the words feeling heavy in his mouth. He looked at Kalen. The partial bonding. You mentioned it. A way to share the load. Jax, no, Kalen said, standing up. Partial bonding is theoretical. It means you'd have to let that nanomesh link into your brain. You'd have to feel everything she feels. If it goes wrong, you don't just lose your mind. You lose yourself. You become a ghost in your own body. I'm already a ghost, Kyle, Jaxen said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. I've been dead since Xylos. The only thing that's been keeping me moving is spite and scrap metal. If this works, if we can stop this... He turned to Lyra. She was watching him, her amber eyes shimmering with a mix of fear and a burgeoning hope that made his heart ache. I'm not letting you go into that spire alone, he said, and I'm not letting you burn out. We do this together, or we don't do it at all. Jaxen Vane, she whispered. You are the most stubborn human I have ever encountered. Yeah, well, someone's got to be, he grunted. Kalen sighed, rubbing his face with his grease-stained hands. All right, if we're doing this, we need to move. The Bureau is going to turn the spires upside down looking for you. We need to get to Sector 1 before the festival reaches its climax at midnight tomorrow. We'll need weapons, Jaxen said. Real ones. None of this kinetic pea-shooter crap. And we'll need a way past the sector checkpoints. I can handle the transport, Kalen said, a spark of his old mischievous self returning. I've got an old delivery skiff with a cloaking field that works about 60% of the time. As for the weapons, check the back locker. I've been holding on to some Xylos-era pulse rifles for a rainy day. Jaxen walked to the locker and pulled out a heavy matte black rifle. It was old, scarred, and smelled of gun oil. It felt right in his hands. He looked at Lyra, who was watching the weapon with a look of profound distaste. I know, Jaxen said. It's a knife, but sometimes you have to cut the cancer out before you can heal. As they prepared for the journey to Sector 1, The weight of the task ahead began to settle on Jackson's shoulders. They were three people, one broken soldier, one disgraced hacker, and one alien who was literally glowing with the power of a dying sun, against the combined might of two interstellar empires. The odds were impossible. The risk was total. But as Jaxen watched Lyra adjust one of her stabilizers, he felt a strange sense of clarity. For the first time in 4 years, he wasn't just fixing a machine. He was fighting for something that couldn't be quantified in credits or scrap value. He was fighting for the truth. "Kyle," Jaxen called out as they headed for the skiff. "How much is 60% in human terms?" "It means we're probably going to get shot at, Jax," Kalen yelled back. "Good," Jaxen muttered, slamming a fresh power cell into his rifle. I was starting to get bored. As the skiff rose from the depths of the salvage yard, cloaking field flickering like a dying candle, Jaxen looked back at the iron spires. The city was a monument to human greed and alien ambition, a vertical jungle of steel and lies. But somewhere in that jungle, Marcus was waiting, and millions of others were walking toward a trap they didn't even know existed. He looked at Lyra, who was staring out at the city lights. Her skin was pulsing with a soft, steady, violet light. "You okay, Sparky?" She turned to him, her amber eyes reflecting the glow of the dashboard. "I am apprehensive, Jaxen, but for the first time since I arrived on this world, I do not feel alone." Jaxen didn't say anything. He just gripped the controls of the skiff and pushed the thrusters to their limit. They had 36 hours to save the world, or lose themselves in the attempt. As they crossed the boundary into Sector 3, the first of the heavy rain began to fall, acidic, oily droplets that sizzled against the skiff's hull. Below them, the city began to light up for the festival, a million artificial lights masking a darkness that no sun could ever reach. The hunt was on, and Jaxen Vane was finally back in the fight. He checked his wristcom one last time. The V-pulse refractor was still there, a ticking time bomb on his arm. He didn't take it off. He would need it to find the spire. He would need it to link with Lyra. He would need it to become something more than a man. The soldier in him was ready to die, but the man in him, the man was just beginning to live. "Hang on," Jaxen said as they dived into a narrow canyon between two massive skyscrapers. "It's about to get bumpy." Outside, the wind began to howl, and in the distance, the central transmission spire pierced the clouds like a poisoned needle, waiting for the midnight hour. The architecture of lies was tall, but Jaxen Vane had spent his whole life tearing down things that weren't built to last. And this time, he was bringing the light. The transition from Sector 4 to Sector 1 was not a journey. It was a betrayal of reality. Kalen's delivery skiff, a battered slab of carbon fiber held together by prayer and illegal welds, groaned as it breached the atmospheric scrubbers that separated the slums from the seat of power. Below them, the sprawling rust and chaotic neon of the iron spires vanished, replaced by a terrifyingly sterile elegance. Here the towers were not made of corrugated steel, but of white synth marble and self-cleaning glass that reflected the artificial sunlight in blinding, pristine sheets. "Keep the cloak at 60%, Kale," Jaxen muttered, his hand white-knuckled on the safety rail. "Any higher and the emitters will overheat and blow the power core. Any lower and we're just a target for the high-altitude interceptors." "I'm doing my best, Jax," Kalen snapped, his fingers flying across a holographic interface that was sparking with static. This bucket wasn't meant for stealth. It was meant for hauling illicit moonshine and stolen copper. We're currently broadcasting enough of a thermal signature to be seen from the moon, but I've masked us as a sanitation drone. Lyra sat in the shadows of the cargo hold, her silver hair shimmering with a dim, troubled light. The magenta glow had deepened into a bruised purple, and her breathing was synchronized with the low hum of the skiff's engines. She looked out the viewport at the sprawling parks and manicured gardens of Sector 1, a paradise built on the silence of the sectors below. "It is so quiet," she whispered. "That's the sound of a successful harmonization, Lyra," Jaxen said, his voice dripping with venom. "No protests, no crime, no loud music. Just 20,000 people all thinking exactly what the government wants them to think." They landed the skiff in an automated waste management bay 3 kilometers from the central transmission spire. The air here didn't smell like ozone or recycled sweat. It smelled like nothing. It was filtered to a degree that felt unnatural, leaving Jaxen's lungs feeling thin and unsatisfied. As they stepped onto the polished white deck of the bay, Jaxen checked his pulse rifle. He had 3 power cells left, enough for a short, violent engagement, but nowhere near enough for a prolonged siege. "We need to find a way into the maintenance tunnels," Kalen said, tapping his wristcom. "I've got a blueprint of the lower levels, but the security encryption is shifting every 15 minutes. It's like the building itself is alive." They moved through the shadows of the automated loaders, 3 ghosts in a city of perfect order. As they approached a pedestrian walkway, Jaxen pulled them back into an alcove. A group of citizens was walking toward a nearby transit hub. They were dressed in flowing silks of cream and gold, their faces serene, their movements fluid and deliberate. Jaxen watched them, his eyes narrowing. He saw a man who looked to be in his late 50s, his eyes a dull, vacant gray. A Vorgari specialist walked beside him, their hands nearly touching. The man didn't look like a slave. He looked like someone who had finally found peace after a long, painful life. "Look at them," Lyra said, her voice trembling. "They feel content. The resonance is broadcasting a frequency of pure tranquility." "It's a lie, Lyra," Jaxen hissed. "Tranquility without the choice to be miserable isn't peace. It's a lobotomy." They reached the service entrance of a secondary processing facility. Kalen bypassed the lock with a localized EMP burst, and they slipped inside. But as the lights flickered on, Jaxen felt a cold, sharp shock go through his system. This wasn't a maintenance room, it was a holding ward. Rows of glass cylinders lined the walls, each one filled with a viscous, translucent fluid. Inside the cylinders were people, humans, some still in their work uniforms, others in the rags of Sector 4. They weren't dead. Their chests moved in slow, rhythmic pulses, and their brains were encased in a glowing web of biogenic filaments. "Processing Center 12B, Kalen whispered, reading a display on a nearby terminal. "These are the resistors, people whose neural pathways didn't take to the initial broadcast. They're being recalibrated." Jaxen walked down the row of cylinders, his boots echoing on the sterile floor. He stopped at a cylinder near the end. His heart stopped. Inside the glass was a man with a jagged scar running from his temple to his jaw. A scar Jaxen had seen every day for 3 years in the trenches of Xylos. "Sarge?" Jaxen whispered, his hand pressing against the cold glass. It was Elias. Sergeant Elias Thorne, the man who had pulled Jaxen out of a collapsing bunker, while Vorgari plasma rained down like God's own wrath. Elias had been the toughest, most stubborn son of a gun Jaxen had ever known. He was the man who had taught Jaxen that a soldier's first duty was to the person standing next to him, not the flag. Now Elias was floating in a tank, his face frozen in a terrifying, blissful smile. The biogenic mesh was thick around his temples, glowing with a soft, parasitic light. "They found him," Jaxen rasped, his voice breaking. "He was one of the few who made it back. He told me he was going to open a bar in Sector 3. He said he was done with the war." "They didn't want him done, Jax," Kalen said softly, standing behind him. "They wanted his experience, his loyalty. They're rewriting him to be the perfect enforcer." Lyra approached the tank, her hand hovering over the glass. "I can feel him. His mind is screaming, Jaxen." Beneath the blanket of the resonance, the real Elias is trapped in a nightmare he cannot wake from. He is fighting the sink with every ounce of his soul. Jaxen's grip on his pulse rifle tightened until his knuckles bled. The prejudice he had carried, the belief that the Vorgari were the monsters, shattered in the face of this horror. The monsters weren't the twilight-skinned people from the stars. The monsters were the ones who had seen the Vorgari's natural gift for connection and turned it into a factory for human souls. "We're not just stopping a signal, Kale," Jaxen said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "We're burning this whole place to the ground." "Jax, we don't have the ordnance for that," Kalen warned. "I don't care. I'm not leaving my people in jars like specimens." Suddenly, the lights in the ward turned a harsh, clinical red. A siren began to wail, a low-frequency moan that felt like a saw against Jaxen's teeth. "Containment breach detected," a calm, feminine voice announced over the speakers. "Security protocols initiated. Lethal force authorized." "Snafu!" Kalen yelled, grabbing his datapad. "They've got our position. We need to move now." The doors at the far end of the ward hissed open, and a squad of Bureau enforcers stepped through. But they weren't the gray-suited officers from the gantry. These were soldiers in heavy white armor, their helmets featuring glowing T-shaped visors. Beside them walked three Vorgari, their eyes pulsing with an aggressive, jagged orange light. "The Ironheads have specialists with them," Jaxen shouted, shoving Kalen toward a row of storage crates. "Lyra, get down!" Jaxen opened fire. The pulse rifle kicked against his shoulder, spitting bolts of superheated plasma that splashed against the Enforcers' shields. The Enforcers returned fire with inhibitor rifles, the air sizzling with neural energy that made Jaxen's hair stand on end. One of the Vorgari specialists stepped forward, their hands raised. A visible wave of psychic pressure rippled through the air, hitting Jaxen like a physical blow. He felt his vision blur, his thoughts splintering into 1,000 shards of doubt and fear. "Why are you fighting?" a voice whispered in his mind. "It's so much easier to let go. Just stop. Just rest." Jaxen's finger tightened on the trigger, but his muscles felt like they were turning to lead. He looked at Elias in the tank, the blissful smile mocking him. "No," Jaxen gasped, biting his tongue until the copper taste of blood cleared his head. "I'd rather die miserable than live as a puppet." He fired a burst at the Vorgari specialist. The bolt clipped the alien's shoulder, breaking the psychic link. Jaxen didn't stop. He vaulted over a crate, his movements a blur of combat-honed instinct. He reached the first enforcer and slammed the butt of his rifle into the soldier's visor, the reinforced glass shattering with a satisfying crack. But there were too many of them. Another enforcer leveled his inhibitor at Jaxen's chest. "Freeze, Vane!" the soldier yelled. "One more move and I'll flatline your nervous system." Before the soldier could fire, a scream of pure melodic fury erupted from the back of the ward. Lyra stood up, her body wreathed in a blinding magenta aura. The biogenic dust was pouring out of her skin in visible clouds, swirling around her like a miniature nebula. Her eyes were solid white again, and the air around her began to hum with a frequency so high it made the glass cylinders vibrate. "Enough!" she cried. She slammed her hands together, and a massive pulse of resonance energy tore through the room. It wasn't a command. It was a sensory overload. The enforcers dropped their weapons, clutching their helmets as their neural links were overloaded with a surge of raw, unrefined emotion. The Vorgari specialists fell to their knees, their orange eyes fading to a dull, confused amber. The resonance wave hit Jaxen too, but instead of pain, he felt a surge of strength. He felt Lyra's resolve, her anger at the desecration of her people's gift, and her desperate need to protect him. The pulse shattered the glass of the nearest tanks. Fluid spilled onto the floor in a shimmering wave. Elias Thorne fell out of his cylinder, gasping and coughing, the biogenic mesh around his head dissolving into smoke. "Go!" Lyra gasped, her glow fading as she collapsed to one knee. "The pulse? It will only stun them for a few minutes. We have to reach the spire." Jaxen grabbed Elias, hauling the dazed sergeant to his feet. "Kyle, get him to the skiff. Use the emergency override." "What about you?" Kalen asked, his eyes wide. "I'm going with Lyra," Jaxen said, looking at the twilight-skinned woman who had just saved his life. "We're finishing this. Now move." Kalen didn't argue. He draped Elias's arm over his shoulder and disappeared into the maintenance tunnel. Jaxen reached Lyra and pulled her to her feet. She was shaking, her skin cold to the touch. The effort of the pulse had taken a massive toll. "You okay, Sparky?" She looked at him, her eyes tired but clear. "I am depleted. The third day is beginning, Jaxen. The resonance is no longer a choice. It is a tide, and I am being pulled out to sea." "Then we'll swim together," Jaxen said, checking his last power cell. "Come on, the central spire is just across the plaza. Let's go show them what a real integration looks like." As they stepped out of the processing center into the pristine streets of Sector 1, the artificial sun lamps were beginning to dim, preparing for the midnight festival. The spire loomed above them, a needle of white light piercing the dark sky. The turning point had passed. Jaxen Vane no longer fought for humanity against the Vorgari. He fought for the soul of every living thing in the spires. And as they moved toward the needle, He knew that the cost of victory might be everything he had left. The plaza surrounding the central transmission spire was a masterpiece of architectural arrogance. It was a vast open circle of white stone, centered on a spire that rose 500 meters into the air like a finger accusing the heavens. At the base of the spire, thousands of people were already gathering for the Harmonization Festival. They stood in silent, orderly ranks, their faces turned upward toward the glowing tip of the needle. Jaxen and Lyra moved through the ornamental gardens that fringed the plaza, staying low behind the sculpted hedges. Every 100 meters, a security drone drifted overhead, its searchlight scanning for any sign of disharmony. "The frequency is changing," Lyra whispered, her hand gripping Jaxen's arm. Her skin was pulsing with a rhythmic violet light that matched the hum of the spire. "The broadcast has moved into the preparatory phase. They are priming the nanomesh in the citizens. In 1 hour, when the fleet enters orbit, the final command will be sent." Jaxen checked his chrono display. 2,300 hours, we have 60 minutes before the whole world turns into a puppet show. He looked at Lyra. Her condition was worsening by the minute. The biogenic dust was thick in the air around her, a shimmering haze that made her look blurred at the edges. She was struggling to keep her feet, her body sagging against him. "The focal point," she gasped. "Jaxen, I cannot hold it back much longer. My mind is expanding. I can feel every person in this plaza. I can feel their dreams, their fears, their emptiness." "I'm here," Jaxen said, pulling her into a small, secluded maintenance alcove beneath the plaza's surface. He sat her down against a wall of humming power conduits. He could feel the vibration of the spire through the stone, a deep, subsonic throb that felt like a headache in his bones. "We need to do the partial bond," Jaxen said. "Now, before we get to the transmitter. If you go into that room at full power without a ground, you'll pop like a defective capacitor." Lyra looked at him, her amber eyes shimmering with tears of liquid silver. "Jaxen, do you truly understand what you are asking? Once we link, there is no unlinking. You will never be alone in your own head again. You will feel my grief for my people. You will feel the weight of 1,000 years of Vorgari memory. And you'll feel what it's like to be a cranky, stubborn scavenger with a bad knee and a grudge against the world," Jaxen said, a small, lopsided smile touching his lips. "Seems like a fair trade." He reached out and took her hands. "Do it, Lyra. Show me what it means to be heard." Lyra closed her eyes. She leaned forward, pressing her forehead against his. The first sensation was one of cooling water. The heat of Jaxen's anger and the sharp edges of his trauma were washed away by a wave of pure, empathic understanding. But then, the water turned to a torrent. A jagged bolt of connection tore through Jaxen's mind. He saw the Vorgari homeworld, a planet of purple forests and floating cities where every living thing was part of a grand, silent chorus. He felt the beauty of that world, the sheer, breathtaking joy of knowing exactly how your neighbor felt, of never having to explain your pain because it was already shared. But then he felt the corruption. He saw the high command, the ones who had decided that the chorus should have only one conductor. He felt the pain of the Vorgari soldiers who had been forced to kill humans. Their own empathy turned into a weapon against them. Every death on Xylos hadn't just been a human life lost. It had been a psychic scar on the Vorgari who took it. Jaxen's own memories surged forward, unbidden. He was back in the trenches. He saw Sergeant Elias. He saw the faces of the boys who hadn't made it back. But this time, he didn't just see his own pain. He saw the Vorgari on the other side of the plasma fire. He saw their fear. He saw that they didn't want to be there any more than he did. The prejudice that had been his armor for 4 years dissolved into nothing. The enemies he had hated weren't monsters. They were victims of the same machine that was now trying to harvest Earth. "Jaxen!" Lyra's voice was inside his head now, a soft, resonant echo. "I am sorry. I did not know the depth of your loss." "It's okay," Jaxen thought back, the concept of speech feeling clumsy and unnecessary. "We're sharing it now. That's the point, isn't it? To take the load?" As the bond stabilized, Jaxen felt a new sensation. Strength. The biogenic mesh in his own brain, the one Kalen had warned him about, wasn't enslaving him. Because Lyra was the focal point, the mesh was acting as a bridge. He was no longer just Jaxen Vane. He was a human grounded by a Vorgari soul. He felt faster, sharper. His senses were heightened to an impossible degree. He could hear the footfalls of security drones 3 levels up. He could smell the ozone of the spire's primary emitters. He stood up, pulling Lyra with him. She was still glowing, but the light was no longer erratic. It was steady, focused. The transmission core is located at the very top of the spire, Lyra said, her voice now a perfect blend of her own melody and Jaxen's grit. We must take the central elevator. But it is guarded by the director's personal guard. Then we'll give them a personal greeting, Jaxen said, checking the power cell on his pulse rifle. It was glowing a bright, healthy blue, fed by the residual energy of their bond. They emerged from the alcove and moved toward the base of the spire. The plaza was a sea of people now, thousands of humans and Vorgari standing in eerie, perfect silence. As Jaxen and Lyra moved through the crowd, some of the citizens turned to look at them. Their vacant gray eyes flickered for a moment, a spark of confusion appearing as Jaxen's grounded presence disrupted the resonance frequency. They're waking up, Jaxen whispered, just by us being here. The bond is a disruption, Lyra replied. It is a frequency of truth in a symphony of lies. They reached the main entrance of the spire. 2 elite enforcers stood guard, their heavy plasma repeaters leveled at the crowd. Behind them, standing on a raised dais, was Director Valerius. He looked even colder in person, his white uniform immaculate, his eyes sharp with a dark, calculating intelligence. Citizen Vane, Valerius said, his voice amplified by the plaza's sound system. I must admit, I am impressed. I didn't think a scavenger from Sector 4 had the capacity for such intricate rebellion. Jaxen stepped out of the crowd, Lyra standing close beside him. He didn't raise his rifle yet. He didn't need to. The air around him was shimmering with the power of the bond. The rebellion isn't mine, Valerius, Jaxen said, his voice carrying across the plaza without the need for a microphone. It belongs to everyone you've tried to put in a jar. It belongs to every soldier you left to die and every citizen you're trying to turn into a drone. Valerius laughed, a dry, soulless sound. You speak of freedom as if it were a virtue, Jaxen. But look at this city. Look at the sectors below. Freedom gave us poverty, crime, and war. Harmonization gives us order. It gives us peace. What is a single soul compared to the stability of a world? A soul is everything, Lyra said, stepping forward. Her voice resonated with the power of her homeworld's forests. You have taken our gift and turned it into a cage. You do not offer peace, Director. You offer the silence of the grave. Valerius's expression darkened. A poetic sentiment, specialist. But unfortunately, the clock has run out. The fleet is in position. The final synchronization begins now. He tapped a control on his wrist. High above, the tip of the spire erupted in a massive, blinding beam of white light. The air in the plaza turned to static. Thousands of people groaned in unison, their hands flying to their heads as the final command signal tore through their minds. Now! Jaxen yelled. He raised his rifle and fired. The pulse of energy didn't hit the enforcers. It hit the spire's ground-level power conduit. A massive explosion of blue sparks threw the guard's back, and the central elevator doors hissed open. Jaxen and Lyra dove inside. As the elevator accelerated upward, the floors flashing by in a blur of white, Jaxen felt the full weight of the planetary signal hitting his mind. It was a crushing, suffocating pressure, a billion voices all screaming for him to obey, to conform, to disappear. But Lyra was there. Her hand was in his, her mind a beacon of light in the darkness. Hold on, Jaxen, she whispered in his head. The top is near. We only need one more pulse. I'm not letting go, Jaxen promised. The cost of their defiance was becoming clear. Jaxen could feel his own neural pathways straining under the feedback of the bond. His nose began to bleed, and his vision was tunneling. He was learning the lesson the hard way. That connection wasn't a one-way street. To save them all, he had to be willing to lose himself in the process. The elevator slowed. The doors slid open to reveal the primary transmission chamber, a vast, circular room filled with humming machinery and the blinding core of the white beam. And standing in the center of the room, waiting for them, was the final guardian. It wasn't a soldier, it was a machine, a massive, multi-limbed construct built from Vorgari technology in human steel, its sensors glowing with the orange light of the Empire. "The Sovereign Sentinel," Lyra whispered. "Great," Jaxen grunted, wiping the blood from his face. "Another thing that needs fixing." The turning point had led them to the heart of the machine. The battle for the spires was no longer a matter of survival. It was a matter of who could hold on to their humanity the longest when the world was trying to take it away. Jaxen Vane took a deep breath, adjusted his grip on his rifle, and felt the heartbeat of the alien woman beside him. The symphony was reaching its climax, and he was ready to play the final discordant note. The Sovereign Sentinel was not merely a machine, it was a blasphemy of engineering. Standing 10 meters tall in the center of the circular transmission chamber, it looked like a prehistoric arachnid forged from the white, clinical alloys of the Alliance and the living, translucent obsidian of the Vorgari Empire. 6 multi-jointed limbs, tipped with vibrating monomolecular blades, twitched with a terrifying insectoid grace. Its central chassis was a hollowed-out sphere of reinforced glass, inside of which floated a brain. Not a biological one, but a massive, pulsing cluster of biogenic crystals that hummed with the collective malice of 1,000 directives. "That thing is a real piece of work," Jaxen hissed, his voice echoing in his own mind as much as in the room. Through the neural bond, he felt Lyra's revulsion. To her, the Sentinel was a desecration of her people's sacred geometry. To him, it was just another clanker that needed to be put in the scrap heap. "It is connected directly to the Spire's primary power core," Lyra's voice resonated in his consciousness. "The Sentinel is the physical manifestation of the system's firewall. If we do not disable it, I cannot reach the transmitter. But Jaxen, it is shielded against empathy. It has no soul to ground." "Good," Jaxen grunted, checking the charge on his pulse rifle. "I'm not in a grounding mood. I'm in a breaking mood." The Sentinel's central crystal cluster turned a jagged, aggressive red. A subsonic roar shook the floor, and the machine lunged. It moved with a speed that defied its massive bulk, one of its blades whistling through the air where Jaxen's head had been a fraction of a second earlier. Jaxen rolled to his left, firing a 3-round burst. The plasma splashed harmlessly against the Sentinel's white and black armor. He felt a sharp, stinging pain in his own shoulder, a sympathetic echo of the Sentinel's impact against the floor. The bond was a double-edged sword. He was feeling the world through Lyra's heightened sensitivity, and every vibration felt like a hammer blow. "Stay back, Sparky," Jaxen yelled, his street slang returning as the adrenaline spiked. "This rust bucket is a heavy hitter." "I cannot stay back," Lyra cried, her body wreathed in violet fire. She raised her hands, sending a bolt of pure resonance toward the Sentinel's legs. The machine staggered, the frequency of the pulse disrupting its gyroscopic stabilizers. "We are one circuit now, Jaxen. If you fall, I flicker out." The Sentinel recovered, its multi-limbed chassis spinning like a deadly top. It unleashed a barrage of micro-missiles from its shoulders. "Check your 6, Jaxen roared, grabbing Lyra and diving behind a massive server bank. The explosions rocked the chamber, sending shards of white marble and molten silicon raining down on them. Through the smoke, Jaxen saw the Sentinel recalibrating, its sensors scanning for their thermal signatures. Suddenly, his wrist comm crackled with static-laced audio. It was Kalen, his voice frantic and layered with the roar of engines. "Jax, if you're still breathing, you've got about 5 minutes of air left," Kalen screamed over the comms. "The Alliance fleet just exited the jump gate. They're entering low orbit. The sky is literally turning white with Vorgari ships. If that signal doesn't stop now, we're all going to be flatlined." "We're a bit busy with a giant metal spider, Kale," Jaxen shouted back. "Where's the skiff?" "I'm playing decoy with the Ironheads," Kalen yelled. "I've got 3 interceptors on my tail, and the cloaking field is officially snafu. I'm going to try to draw them into the upper atmosphere scrubbers. It's been a hell of a ride, gearhead. See you on the other side." The comms cut out into a hiss of white noise. Jaxen felt a cold weight in his chest. Kalen, the man who hated heights and was terrified of anything more dangerous than a soldering iron, was sacrificing himself for a scavenger and an alien. It was the ultimate defiance of the Alliance's logic. "He's not going to make it, is he?" Lyra's thought was a soft mourning chord in Jackson's mind. He's a survivor, Lyra, Jackson lied, though he felt her disbelief through the bond. But we don't have time to mourn. That clanker is coming for us again. The Sentinel smashed through the server bank as if it were made of cardboard. It loomed over them, its monomolecular blades glowing with a deadly heat. Jackson leveled his rifle, but he knew he didn't have enough power to pierce the main chassis. Then he looked at Lyra. Her skin was pulsing with a violent, beautiful magenta light. The biogenic dust was so thick around her now that she looked like a star trapped in a human shape. The prejudice he'd held for years, the idea that the Vorgari were just cold, calculating invaders, finally vanished. He saw the truth. They were a species of poets and musicians whose very biology was built for love, and the Alliance had turned them into a battery. Lyra, Jackson whispered, the Sentinel. It's not shielded against everything. It's part human engineering, right? It uses Alliance processors. Yes, she replied, her amber eyes glowing with a desperate intensity. But those processors are isolated from the Vorgari frequency. Not if we use the bridge, Jackson said, pointing to his own head. The partial bond. It's using my neural pathways to ground you. If I can get close enough to that crystal cluster, if I can touch it, you can channel the pulse through me. I'll be the conductor. Lyra's mind recoiled in horror. Jackson, no. The raw energy of the peak resonance, if it passes through a human brain without the full bond, it will scorch your consciousness. You won't just be a ghost, you'll be cinders. It's the only way to short the firewall, Jackson insisted, his voice steady despite the subsonic roar of the Sentinel. I'm a scavenger, remember. I know how to handle high-voltage junk. Besides, I spent years hating your people because I thought you were heartless. I'm not going to let a heartless machine win now. The Sentinel lunged again, its blades descending in a lethal arc. Jackson didn't roll away this time. He stepped into the strike, using the stock of his rifle to parry the blade. The impact shattered the rifle's housing, sending a jolt of electricity through Jackson's arms that made his teeth ache. But it gave him the opening he needed. He vaulted onto the Sentinel's chassis, his boots slipping on the polished alloy. He scrambled up the machine's back, dodging the frantic stabs of its secondary limbs. He reached the central glass sphere, the pulsing biogenic crystals just inches away. Now, Lyra, he screamed. Hit it with everything you've got. Lyra stood in the center of the chamber, her arms outstretched. She looked like a goddess of the void, her silver hair flowing in a gale of her own making. She let out a cry that was both a song and a battle shriek. A pillar of pure, unfiltered violet light erupted from her, striking Jackson square in the chest. The world vanished. Jackson felt his ego shredding. He was no longer Jaxen Vane. He was the trenches of Xylos. He was the smog of iron spires. He was the grief of 1,000 widows and the laughter of 100 children. He was every human who had ever fought for an inch of dirt, and every Vorgari who had ever longed for a single moment of true silence. The energy poured through him, a raging river of empathy that found the cold, sterile logic of the Sentinel's processors and began to melt them. He felt the machine's confusion, its artificial intellect trying to categorize the raw emotion of a human soul and failing. Does not compute, the machine's logic screamed. Empathy is not a variable. Love is not a protocol. It is now, Jackson roared, his voice sounding like a choir of thunder. The glass sphere shattered. The biogenic crystals exploded in a shower of white dust. The Sentinel let out one final, mechanical groan and collapsed, its limbs twitching for a moment before going dark. Jackson fell from the chassis, hitting the cold stone floor like a sack of discarded parts. He couldn't feel his legs. He couldn't see anything but a hazy violet mist. He felt his consciousness drifting, pulling away from the physical world like a ship whose anchor had been cut. So this is how it ends, he thought, a strange sense of peace washing over him, not with a bang, but with a song. But then he felt a hand on his cheek. It was warm, soft, and smelled of jasmine and ozone. Not yet, Jaxen Vane, Lyra's voice whispered in his mind. The symphony is not over. We still have the final movement. He felt her energy flowing back into him, not the violent fire of the resonance, but a gentle, steady warmth that knitted his fractured thoughts back together. He opened his eyes. Lyra was kneeling over him, her face beautiful and terrible in its radiance. "The Sentinel is down," she said, helping him to his feet. "But the fleet is in position. We have less than 10 minutes. Jaxen looked around the wrecked chamber. The white marble was scorched, the air thick with the smell of burnt silicon and alien pheromones. He looked at the central transmission core, a massive humming cylinder of light that rose from the floor and disappeared into the ceiling. "The bridge is open," Jaxen said, wiping the blood from his eyes. "Let's go tell the world the truth." As they moved toward the core, Jaxen felt a change in the air. The subsonic throb of the spire had reached its peak. The resonance was here. The third day had arrived. He wasn't just a scavenger anymore. He was a man who had looked into the heart of his enemy and found himself. And as they stepped into the light of the core, Jaxen Vane knew that the real battle was only just beginning. The primary transmission core was a vertical ocean of white fire contained within a cylinder of reinforced magnetic fields. This was the heart of the needle, the place where the collective will of the Alliance and the biological power of the Vorgari were fused into a single devastating signal. As Jaxen and Lyra approached the control console, the elevator at the far end of the room chimed. The doors slid open to reveal Director Valerius. He was alone, his white uniform singed at the edges, his face a mask of cold, calculated fury. He held a small, elegant device in his hand, a master override key. "You have caused a significant delay in the schedule, Citizen Vane," Valerius said, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "But in the end, you are merely a malfunction in a much larger system. A glitch that is about to be patched." Jaxen leveled his broken pulse rifle at the director. "The only glitch here is you, Valerius. You and your jar-collecting buddies." Valerius looked at the rifle and chuckled. "That weapon is depleted, Jaxen. And even if it weren't, you wouldn't fire. Through your fascinating bond with the specialist, you have become soft. You feel the weight of every life in this city, don't you? You wouldn't want to add my death to the tally." "I'm a scavenger," Jaxen said, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm used to getting rid of trash." "Wait," Lyra said, her hand on Jackson's arm. She stepped forward, her light dimming to a steady, regal glow. "Director, look at the plaza below. Look at the thousands of people who are suffering because of your order. Do you truly believe that a world without choice is a world worth leading?" "I believe in survival," Valerius snapped. "Humanity was a fractured, violent species on the brink of self-destruction. The Vorgari offered us the ultimate tool for stability. I didn't steal their gift, I perfected it. I am the architect of the first truly peaceful era in human history." "Peace without empathy is just a cemetery with better lighting," Jaxen spat. "You're not an architect. You're just a coward who's afraid of a world he can't control." Valerius's face contorted. He pressed a button on the override key. The white fire in the core began to pulse with a dark, jagged rhythm. The hum of the spire increased to a deafening roar. "The signal is locked," Valerius shouted over the noise. "The fleet is receiving the final synchronization command. In 60 seconds, the nanomesh will permanently bond with every human nervous system on this planet. Freedom is over, Vane. Welcome to the future." Jaxen felt the signal hitting his brain like a physical assault. The biogenic filaments in his mind began to glow, trying to force his thoughts into the cold, compliant patterns of the Alliance. He felt the collective consciousness of Iron Spire's groaning, thousands of souls being snuffed out by the weight of the command. "Lyra!" Jaxen yelled, his vision starting to tunnel. "The reset! Do it now!" "I cannot!" Lyra cried, her voice echoing with despair. "The director's override has locked the frequency. I cannot break through the Alliance encryption from the outside. I must enter the core." Jaxen looked at the pillar of white fire. "If you go in there, if you broadcast from inside the magnetic field, the feedback will destroy you. You told me yourself. You'll become cinders." "It is the only way to send the reset pulse to the fleet," Lyra said, her amber eyes fixed on his. "The signal must come from the source of the resonance. I must complete the cycle, Jaxen. I must be heard." Jaxen felt her resolve through the bond. It wasn't the suicidal impulse of a martyr. It was the ultimate act of connection. She was willing to lose herself to save a species that had spent 10 years trying to kill her own. The prejudice he had felt at the beginning The idea that she was an invader, a sparky, a glowworm, was replaced by a profound sense of shame. He had been the one who was small. He had been the one who was blind. "No," Jaxen said, his voice cracking. "I'm not letting you go alone. Jaxen, you cannot survive the core." "Then we'll burn together," Jaxen said, grabbing her hand. "You said we were one circuit, Lyra. You grounded me. Now let me be your focal point. One last time." He looked at Director Valerius, who was watching them with a mix of fascination and horror. "You want to see a real synchronization, Valerius?" Jaxen roared. "Watch this!" Jaxen and Lyra stepped into the light. The agony was instantaneous and absolute. The magnetic fields tore at Jaxen's cells, and the raw energy of the core threatened to vaporize his blood. But beneath the pain, there was something else. The bond. In the heart of the needle, the partial bond between the scavenger and the specialist reached its final, inevitable conclusion. Jaxen didn't just feel Lyra's emotions. He was Lyra. He felt her silver hair flowing in the solar winds of her homeworld. He felt the song of the Vorgari forests, and she was Jaxen. She felt the grit of the spires, the smell of grease and burnt coffee, and the fierce, unyielding love he had for a world that had never given him anything but scars. They were no longer two beings. They were a single, brilliant point of light, a human Vorgari hybrid consciousness that existed outside the logic of empires and treaties. In that moment of total connection, the Alliance's encryption felt like a child's toy. The hive mind command was a whisper against the roar of their shared truth. "Now!" Their combined voice echoed through the spire. They unleashed the reset pulse. It wasn't a bolt of energy. It was a wave of pure, unfiltered memory. They broadcast their bond. They broadcast the feeling of being truly known, truly seen, and truly free. They sent the taste of rain, the warmth of a fire, and the bitter, beautiful sting of a life lived by choice. The signal tore through the spire, shattering the dark rhythm of Valerius's command. It raced across the plaza, hitting the thousands of citizens. The biogenic filaments in their brains didn't just stop. They dissolved, the nanomesh returning to inert dust. The signal reached the fleet in orbit. On 100 Vorgari ships, the soldiers stopped. They felt the reset pulse. They felt the truth of what had been done to them and to the humans below. The Imperial command structure fractured as 1,000,000 souls suddenly realized they were part of a different kind of chorus. Inside the chamber, the white fire of the core turned a soft, incandescent violet. Director Valerius fell to his knees, his master key clattering to the floor. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, were now wide with a terrifying clarity. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of every soul he had tried to harvest. He felt the pain of Sergeant Elias. He felt the loneliness of Jaxen Vane. The feedback hit him like a physical blow, and he collapsed into a heap of white silk and broken ambition. The spire began to shake. The overload was too much for the physical structure to handle. "We have to go!" Jaxen's voice returned to his own head, though it felt distant and thin. He pulled Lyra out of the core. Both of them were covered in a fine white ash, their own cells being rebuilt by the sheer power of the energy they had channeled. Lyra's glow was gone, her skin now a soft, matte lavender. Her silver hair was scorched and short. Did we do it?" she whispered, her voice a fragile melody. "We did it, Sparky," Jaxen rasped. They staggered toward the elevator. As they descended, the spire began to groan, the white marble cracking as the energy dissipators failed. They reached the ground level just as the first of the secondary explosions rocked the plaza. The crowd was no longer silent. Thousands of people were shouting, crying, and hugging each other. The gray was gone from their eyes. They looked confused, terrified, and wonderful. Jaxen looked up at the sky. The white ships of the fleet were beginning to pull away, their engines glowing with a calm, steady blue as they retreated into the deep dark of space. And then he saw a familiar, battered shape descending through the clouds. Kalen's skiff, its hull scorched black and its wings trailing smoke, drifted toward the plaza. One of its engines was dead, and the cloaking field was flickering like a dying firefly, but it was flying. "The crazy son of a gun made it," Jaxen laughed, the sound turning into a cough that tasted like copper. He looked at Lyra. She was watching the people in the plaza, her amber eyes wet with silver tears. The humanistic theme had moved from subtext to the heart of the world. They hadn't just defeated a politician or a machine. They had defeated the idea that difference was a reason for fear. They had proven that the only true integration was one born of the choice to be vulnerable to another. Jaxen, Lyra said, leaning her head on his shoulder, I can still feel you. The bond. It did not break. I know, Jaxen said, looking out at the city that was no longer perfect, no longer quiet, and finally truly alive. I think I'm going to have to get used to someone else picking my music. As the central transmission spire collapsed in a spectacular display of violet sparks and white dust, the iron spires were plunged into darkness. But in that darkness, 10 million small individual lights began to flicker on. Torches, candles, and the glowing hearts of people who had finally found their way home. The soldier in Jaxen Vane was finally at peace, but the man was ready for the next chapter. The silence that followed the collapse of the central transmission spire was not the peaceful quiet of a forest at dawn. It was the heavy, suffocating stillness of a world that had suddenly forgotten how to breathe. For a few agonizing seconds, the only sound in the ruined plaza was the distant metallic groan of the spire's skeletal remains settling into the scorched earth. White ash, a mixture of vaporized synth marble, and the inert remains of the biogenic mesh, drifted through the air like radioactive snow. Jaxen Vane lay on his back, staring up at a sky that was no longer choked by the white beam. His lungs burned, and every nerve ending in his body felt as if it had been scrubbed with industrial sandpaper. Beside him, Lyra was a crumpled shape of matte lavender, her chest rising and falling in slow, shallow shudders. The violet glow that had defined her presence for the last 3 days was entirely gone, leaving her looking fragile, human, and devastatingly exhausted. Jaxen reached out, his hand shaking so violently he almost couldn't control it. He found her fingers in the ash. The moment their skin touched, the partial bond, now a permanent feature of his psyche, flickered to life. It wasn't the roaring furnace of the core anymore. It was a steady, warm ember. Through the link, he felt her relief, her lingering pain, and a profound, wordless gratitude that they were still alive. "You still there, Sparky?" Jaxen croaked, his voice sounding like it had been dragged through a gravel pit. "I am here, Jaxen," she whispered in his mind, her actual voice too weak to form words. "The frequency it is gone. The sky is empty." Jaxen rolled onto his side, his joints popping with the protest of 20 years of combat stress. He looked across the plaza. The thousands of citizens who had been standing in eerie, perfect ranks were now a chaotic sea of movement. Some were sitting on the ground, heads in their hands, sobbing with the sudden weight of returning memories. Others were wandering aimlessly, touching their faces, blinking at a world they were seeing clearly for the first time in years. He saw a human woman in an expensive Sector 1 gown, kneeling beside a Vorgari specialist. She wasn't recoiling in fear, and the Vorgari wasn't broadcasting a command. They were simply two terrified beings holding on to each other in the ruins of a lie. Jaxen, you old gearhead, tell me you're not flatlined." The roar of a single sputtering engine broke the stillness. Kalen's delivery skiff descended through the ash clouds, looking like a charred piece of toast that had been thrown through a wind tunnel. One of its stabilizing fins was missing, and the hull was riddled with holes from inhibitor fire, but it touched down 20 meters away with a heavy, ungraceful thud. Kalen scrambled out of the hatch before the engines had even fully shut down. He was covered in soot, his goggles cracked, but he was grinning like a madman. Behind him, Sergeant Elias Thorne climbed out more slowly, looking dazed but steady. "Snafu, Jax! Total snafu!" Kalen yelled, sprinting toward them. He slid into the ash on his knees, checking Jackson's vitals with a frantic, trembling hand. The fleet, they just turned around. 1 minute they're prepping for a planetary landing, and the next they're hauling thrusters for the jump gate like they've seen a ghost. "What did you do in there?" "We gave them a piece of our mind, Kale," Jaxen grunted, allowing the hacker to pull him into a sitting position. "Literally." Elias approached, his eyes scanning the plaza with the wary intensity of a soldier who had spent too much time in the trenches. He stopped a few feet away, looking at Lyra, then at the hand Jaxen was still holding. The mesh is gone, Vane, Elias said, his voice deep and raspy. He touched the side of his head where the glowing filaments had been. I can think again. I remember the bar. I remember the boys we lost at Silos. It's like a fog just lifted off the whole world. He looked at Lyra, his jaw tightening for a second. Jaxen felt a surge of protective instinct through the bond, but he forced it down. He needed Elias to see this. He needed the man who had taught him how to fight to see what was worth fighting for. She's the reason we're breathing, Sarge, Jaxen said, his eyes fixed on Elias. She went into the core. She broadcast the reset pulse. If she hadn't, we'd all be wearing white uniforms and smiling at Valerius right now. Elias Thorne was silent for a long moment. He looked at the lavender woman, at her scorched hair and her exhausted eyes. Then he did something Jaxen had never seen him do in all the years of the war. He knelt in the ash and bowed his head. Thank you, Specialist, Elias said, the words heavy with the weight of a man who was re-evaluating 10 years of hatred. Lyra managed a weak, melodic hum of acknowledgement. Through the bond, Jaxen felt her surprise and a blossoming sense of hope that was more intoxicating than any Vorgari pheromone. We need to move, Kalen said, his eyes darting toward the spire's remains. The Alliance Bureau is in shambles, but the local Ironheads are going to wake up soon, and they won't be happy about their toy being broken. I've got enough fuel in the skiff to get us back to the salvage yard in Sector 4. We can disappear there until the dust settles. The dust is never going to settle, Kyle, Jaxen said, looking at the thousands of people in the plaza. This was the easy part. Now we have to figure out how to live together without a machine holding a gun to our heads. They hauled Lyra into the skiff, Jaxen refusing to let go of her hand even for a second. As the battered ship rose into the air, Jaxen looked down at Sector 1. The pristine white towers were already beginning to look different. They looked cold. They looked lonely. But as the skiff crossed the boundary back into the smog-choked air of the lower sectors, he saw something else. Fires were being lit. Not the fires of war, but the small, flickering lights of people gathering together. The Great Awakening was a messy, painful birth, but for the first time in Jaxen Vane's life, the iron spires felt like they might actually be built on something solid. For the next 2 weeks, Jaxen and Lyra remained in the depths of the salvage yard. Kalen worked tirelessly to block any incoming tracking signals, while Elias acted as a sentry, his presence a silent reminder of the bridge they had built. During those 14 days, the world outside descended into a chaotic, beautiful struggle for identity. The Terra Alliance leadership was arrested by their own internal security forces once the truth of the Synaptic Sovereign Project was broadcast globally. The Vorgari High Command, faced with a near-total mutiny from their own fleet, was forced to sign the Treaty of the Unbound, a document that recognized the individual autonomy of every Vorgari and human in the system. But the real work happened in the quiet moments. Jaxen spent hours talking to Lyra, not through their bond, but with actual words. He told her about his parents, who had been simple miners in the asteroid belts. He told her about the first time he'd seen a sky that wasn't artificial. And she told him about the song forests of Velia, about how her people believed that every soul was a single note in a grand, universal melody that had been silenced by the Empire. I spent 10 years trying to kill your notes, Lyra, Jaxen said one evening, sitting on a pile of rusted skyship panels. And I was sent here to harmonize your silence, she replied, her skin now a healthy, glowing violet again. We were both wrong, Jaxen. We were both taught that the only way to be safe was to make the other disappear. I'm glad you're still here, Jaxen said, reaching for her hand. I am always here, she whispered in his head, the bond vibrating with a sense of peace that felt like a sunrise. As the third week began, Kalen walked into the workshop, his datapad glowing with urgent news. The new Provisional Council wants to talk, Jax. They're calling you and Lyra the architects of the Unbound. They want you to help draft the new integration protocols. Real ones. Ones based on, well, whatever it is you two have. Jaxen looked at Lyra. He looked at his scarred hands, then at the glowing woman who was now a permanent part of his soul. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a diplomat. He was a scavenger. But he realized then that maybe that was exactly what the world needed. Someone who knew how to find the value in the things everyone else had thrown away. Tell them we'll be there, Jaxen said, standing up. But tell them we're bringing our own manual. The transition had begun. The scars of the war and the trauma of the Sovereign Project wouldn't heal overnight. There would be more conflicts, more prejudice, and more moments where the darkness threatened to return. But as Jaxen Vane looked at the woman beside him, he knew that they had already won the only battle that mattered. They had chosen to see each other, and in that choice they had found a light that no spire could ever hope to contain. 6 months had passed since the fall of the Central Transmission Spire, and the City of Iron Spires was being renamed. The citizens had voted to call it Ethelgard, an old-world term meaning noble enclosure. But to Jaxen, it would always just be home. Only now, home was a place that didn't require him to keep a kinetic pistol under his pillow. The smog was still there, a persistent reminder of a century of industrial greed. But the air felt different. It was cleaner, not because of the atmospheric scrubbers, but because it wasn't heavy with the subsonic hum of a planetary lie. Jaxen stood on the balcony of their new apartment in Sector 2. It was a modest space filled with a chaotic mixture of human functionality and Vorgari aesthetics. A human-made wooden table sat beneath a floating Vorgari light sculpture that changed color based on the humidity in the room. In the corner, a pile of rusted gears, Jaxen's personal sculpture, sat next to Lyra's meditation crystalline spheres. He was dressed in a simple, charcoal gray suit, a far cry from the grease-stained tunics of his scavenging days. Today was the first assembly of the Unity Council, and as the human representative for the Unbound, he had a speech to give. Lyra stepped out onto the balcony, her silver hair now grown back to its full, shimmering length. She wore a robe of deep emerald silk, her amber eyes bright with a calm, steady light. She didn't need to ask if he was ready. Through the partial bond, she felt his nervousness, his lingering self-doubt, and the fierce, unyielding love that anchored him. "The words will come, Jaxen," she said, her voice a perfect melody in the cool morning air. "Because they are true." Jaxen looked out over the city. Below, he could see humans and Vorgari walking the streets together. It wasn't perfect. He still saw the occasional sideways glance, the lingering hesitation before a human offered a hand to a twilight-skinned visitor. But he also saw children of both species playing in the parks, their laughter blending into a single joyous noise that had nothing to do with synchronization. He looked at his hands. They were still scarred, still calloused, but they were no longer shaking. "I used to think that peace was just the absence of noise," Jaxen said, his voice quiet. "I thought if I could just get far enough away from everyone, I'd be fine. I spent 20 years building walls, Lyra. I thought those walls were what kept me alive." He turned to her, taking her hands in his. "But the walls were just a different kind of jar. I was as trapped as Elias in that tank, only I'd built the tank myself out of my own hate and fear." "And now?" Lyra asked, her eyes searching his. Jaxen smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Now, I think I'd rather be vulnerable and alive than safe and hollow. I'd rather have your voice in my head, even when you're complaining about my taste in music, than be alone in the dark." He stepped back and looked at the city one last time before they headed to the council chambers. He thought about the journey they had taken, from the trenches of Xylos to the heart of the needle. He thought about Kalen, who was now the head of the city's new decentralized data net, and Elias, who had finally opened that bar in Sector 3. It was called the Grounding Point, and it was the most popular spot in the city for both species. Jaxen Vane, the man who had survived the war by refusing to see his enemy, had finally won the peace by choosing to see his friend. He walked over to the table and picked up his speech. He looked at the first line. It didn't talk about treaties or trade agreements. It didn't mention quotas or integration protocols. It said, "We are not the same, and that is our greatest strength." He looked at Lyra, and through the bond, he sent her a wave of pure, unfiltered certainty. She smiled, her skin glowing with a soft, happy violet hue. "Let's go, Sparky," he said, gesturing toward the door. "We have a world to build." They walked out of the apartment together, two beings of different worlds, linked by a choice that no government could mandate and no machine could forge. They were the Unbound. And as they stepped into the light of the new day, the iron spires finally reached for the stars, not as a weapon, but as a bridge. I spent nearly 35 years of my life believing that the world was a zero-sum game. If the Vorgari won, humanity lost. If I let someone in, I gave up a piece of my territory. I viewed every interaction as a tactical engagement, a series of parries and thrusts designed to keep my soul intact by keeping it isolated. I thought my scars were my identity, a map of all the reasons I shouldn't trust the universe. But standing in that core with Lyra, feeling the sheer, overwhelming reality of another being's existence, I realized how small I'd been living. I had been a scavenger not just in my job, but in my heart, picking through the ruins of my own life for scraps of comfort while ignoring the vast, beautiful landscape of connection that was right in front of me. I learned that true courage isn't the ability to face a pulse rifle. It's the ability to look at someone who is fundamentally different from you and say, I want to know you. I learned that we aren't defined by our shadows, but by the light we are willing to share. I'm still a stubborn, cranky man from the slums, but I finally understand that I don't have to carry the weight of the world alone. We were never meant to be a solo performance. We were always meant to be a chorus. I spent a decade hiding behind my anger because it was easier than facing the possibility that I was wrong about my enemies. I wonder, is there a wall you have built around yourself to stay safe from the others in your life? What would happen if you dared to take down just one brick today and truly looked at the person on the other side? Jaxen Vane closed the door to the balcony, his hand lingering on the latch for a moment as he felt the steady, comforting pulse of Lyra's mind against his. He didn't look back at the scrap piles. Instead, he stepped forward into the morning light, ready to hear the next note of a song that was finally his own to sing.